Ed here with the Digital Digest, and today I wanted to share a comparison between the brand new RX10 Mark IV on the right and the Sony A7R Mark II on the left. Now, of course, these are very different cameras. The A7R Mark II is a full-frame camera, interchangeable mirrorless camera at that, with a 42 megapixel sensor, and on the right, the brand new RX10 Mark IV is a bridge-style camera, a fixed lens, a 20 megapixel 1-inch sensor, 24 to 600 millimeter zoom, that is a 35 millimeter equivalent. So it is a little bit of a apples to oranges comparison. However, at $1,700 and $2,400 right now for the A7R Mark II body alone, I could see why people might consider both of these cameras, even though, of course, stepping into any interchangeable lens camera system is a more expensive endeavor. And that's why I'm offering this comparison video, because I have more than enough experience with the A7R Mark II, and I've spent enough time with the RX10 Mark IV to give my impressions of whether or not those of you who are wondering which they should go with, based, of course, on your subjective needs, hopefully I can help lead you in the right direction. So as I mentioned, full frame, 42 megapixel, interchangeable, fixed lens, 1-inch, 20 megapixel sensor. Right there, completely different worlds. But in terms of what it would take to get the type of quality and convenience that the RX10 Mark IV has to offer, it simply doesn't exist in the interchangeable realm. So of course here we've got a full frame sensor, glass that's very expensive. This is the Zeiss wide angle 16 to 35 f4 lens. Of course now there's a G Master version of that that's even more expensive and faster, but ultimately this is all about what style of shooting you plan to do. Now, if you want to have a lens collection, if you're interested in primes, clearly the RX10 Mark IV is not for you. However, this comparison has become more legitimate than ever before, because now what was traditionally a cybershot camera in the RX10 realm, and I've reviewed every version of it, we now have a real autofocus system. And by that I mean hybrid, no different than we would find in basically every interchangeable mirrorless camera from Sony. So, 315 points of phase detection now on this camera, besides the contrast detection that Sony relied on in every previous generation. And this is a big deal because, one, you will not find that with any other bridge camera on the market, and two, even if there were one, it wouldn't have that hybrid autofocus system to back it up. So, if you're looking for the go-to all-in-one camera that can pretty much try to do everything, the RX10 Mark IV affords you exactly that. And at $1,700, it better. It's not inexpensive. You can easily buy into something like the A6500, another comparison I plan on doing because they are definitely closer in price, and when it comes to image sensor size, APS-C certainly much closer to the 1-inch found in the RX10 Mark IV. But there are perceivable advantages, even though I've already told you, the 42 megapixel full frame sensor here is going to offer you just a vast array of, image information and fidelity and dynamic range that you're not going to find with the RX10 Mark IV. In the same vein, in order to accomplish what the RX10 Mark IV can, you will have to spend a small fortune and carry a gear bag, whereas with the Mark IV, you're carrying one device to do everything. So this is really more about convenience and style of shooting than it is about getting the best. And that is really the key on this comparison. Body style, well, they're both weather sealed, neither is weatherproof. In other words, they can be exposed to some water, some dust, conditions, but you don't want to really expose either of these cameras. Another thing to be aware of, both of these cameras have OLED viewfinders. The one on the A7R Mark II is superior, and it should be. Even though the RX10 Mark IV is brand new, I wouldn't expect to see a superior EVF in this camera, and it is not. Both have a hot shoe, as you may have already noticed, and I actually like the body style of the RX10 Mark IV more, and that's because if you take a quick peek here, as I flip them, you can see that the video record button on the RX10 Mark IV is to the right of the EVF, whereas here on the left, the A7R Mark II, it's still on the grip, which I've never liked. Button layout, similar, not identical, but definitely similar. And that's another reason I'm comparing these, because they are very close in terms of design. Menu button, similar location, jog dial button, basically the exact same location. I mean, very, very similar. As I turn them to the side, the ports. You have on both of these cameras a microphone jack, as well as a headphone jack for monitoring. You have clean HDMI output from both of these cameras. You also have micro USB, Sony's multi-port, that can do more than just charge. They both operate using the exact same W-type series battery. In terms of battery life, they're also very close. They both shoot great 4K video, but of course with the RX10 Mark IV, you have the benefit of a power zoom lens that you control, at various speed levels. So if you're doing a lot of mixed shooting, meaning video and still, the RX10 Mark IV is definitely the choice for run and gun style shooting. No flash here on the A7R Mark II. Of course, we do have a built-in flash right here on the RX10 Mark III. When it comes to the quality of the fixed lens Zeiss piece of glass included with or attached really to that 1-inch sensor, the pairing, it does a phenomenal job, just as it did in the previous generation. But the fact that the autofocus is truly competent now makes an incredible difference. It means a lot more keepers. And that's very important to who I think the RX10 Mark IV is aimed at in terms of consumers. But when you get down to pricing, I could easily see why someone would be interested in this camera, the full frame to the left, because you are getting a professional grade tool. Now, the RX10 Mark IV is not that. Let's be clear up front. This is all about meeting your needs specifically. If you're a professional photographer that makes their living taking stills, shooting video, if you're a videographer at a wedding photographer, you do both, whatever it may be, if you do portraits, you really do need something, I think, beyond what the RX10 Mark IV has to offer. But that's not to say that it wouldn't be a great B camera. In fact, I think it's probably the best B camera I've ever touched. Now that's, with taking into account that you have one lens, no interchangeable lens. The buffer has improved, but when it comes to autofocus, just to give you an idea, 24 frames per second. Now, of course, this is a 1-inch sensor, not even an APS-C, but here with the full frame to the left, 5 frames per second. So what I have found thus far in my testing is that the autofocus performance on the RX10 Mark IV, actually outperforms that of the A7R Mark II. But if you're a professional, that isn't really too relevant because you're going to hit your subject no matter what. Autofocus tracking also better with the RX10 Mark IV. But when you pair the A7R Mark II with the right glass, let's say the one that's sitting on it right now, the video quality is still, it's like butter, baby. It is so good that the only thing that's really going to top it is the S series, or of course the brand new A7R Mark III, which hasn't hit shelves yet but will at the end of November. So this really comes down to your style. I mean, both cameras have Wi-Fi, NFC, access to Sony's Play Memory Store, something that's being abandoned with the A7R Mark III. And quite frankly, this review would be less relevant if they weren't so close in price, but they are. $1,700 again for this camera, done. You don't need any accessories except for SD cards, as well as batteries. Here, you're going to have to buy, even if you buy the brand new lens that Sony launched alongside the brand new A7R Mark III, you're still going to be set back with a hefty price tag. I mean, any really good glass, if you jump into the G Master world, the lenses are over $2,000. So this is a matter of budget, but more so, as I mentioned at the top of the video, your shooting style. And whether or not you really want to replace that interchangeable lens camera system with a single device, which is exactly what the RX10 Mark IV can do. Touchscreen here, no touchscreen there, but of course the Mark III, the A7R Mark III, is, going to offer touchscreen capability. Not full touchscreen, but touchscreen as far as Sony will integrate into cameras. I actually think the weather sealing, just the way that Sony employs the actual flaps, if you will, is more solid than what they did on the A7R Mark II. So that says a lot in terms of how much Sony has invested in this camera. I mean, the fact that you get a digital readout atop of the camera is another great touch, something that you maybe would expect to see Sony integrate into their professional grade gear in the mirrorless world, but they still have steered away from that. It's just a design choice, in my opinion. They're trying to, keep things as compact as possible, and also strike a good balance between price and performance. And apparently, this little LCD just wouldn't be a game changer here, and I know exactly why. It just isn't needed. But it is really nice to have on a camera like this that, again, is all about convenience. And part of that convenience is having readout right here, rather than having, to always look to your LCD screen. So, of course, the sensor on the left is better, the EVF is better, overall performance is better, but again, how important is convenience to you? How much is that gear bag hurting your back? And do you make a living off of what you're doing? If it's a hobby, then the RX10 Mark IV really is the champ, in my opinion. No question about it. If you're after shooting birds in flight, the RX10 Mark IV wins. Even if I attach my G Master 100 to 400 full frame piece of glass to the A7R Mark II, I'm not saying that I can't get birds in flight. I absolutely can. You've got 5 frames per second. But the 24 frames per second and the tracking capability of the RX10 Mark IV is better. No question about it. Of course, when I crop those images and get really close, that's where things fall apart. And that's why I keep mentioning, do you make your living shooting? If you do, then you already know that you need a larger sensor. And if you do, and you're considering a smaller sensor, then you maybe for your line of work, you don't necessarily need it, which is why I feel like the RX10 line has always been a photojournalist's dream. If you're out on assignment for whatever it may be, you bring this along, you're not going to need to crop in and see the pores on someone's face or shoot nose hair. Not that that's what people do with the extra megapixels, but I'm just saying you're going to get images that you can absolutely publish, and certainly video that you can publish. Granted, Sony did away with the ND filter on the RX lineup in the last generation when they decided to extend the telephoto range to 600 millimeters. They also gave up that fixed aperture, but now with the autofocus system, it's beyond worth it, in my opinion. They've really created a stunner here, and I think it changes the landscape because it actually does make this a relevant question. Because as much as I love my A7R Mark II, and until the Mark III comes out, nothing stands up to it, the convenience, ease of use, and number of keepers that comes out of the RX10 Mark IV with very little effort is oh so alluring. And that is why I'm even sharing this comparison today. You do have the high frame rate HFR right there setting here, so you can shoot up to 960 frames per second, although I wouldn't recommend more than 240. You could do 120 frames in 1080p. A big advantage, though, that the A7R Mark II has going for it is image stabilization. 5-axis here, which means that when I'm shooting video with this, it often will appear that I'm using a gimbal or some sort of stabilization system. When I'm shooting 4K video with the RX10 Mark IV, as you bring out that telephoto zoom, you're going to want something to stabilize it, whether it's something handheld or a tripod, a video tripod. You're going to want one of those things, or a gimbal system for that matter. And that's something that I would justify in this comparison. Throwing down the money for a gimbal system in this would still make your bag lighter, smaller, and that offsets the 5-axis image stabilization that you get with the A7R Mark II. Keep in mind, both are limited in their video clip recording time to a hair under 30 minutes. That's just a standard because they are still cameras, not video cameras. But you could definitely make the argument that this is one of the best hybrid and video cameras really out there on the market right now, because it does offer professional grade features on the video side in terms of S-Log, all of those things. Not that the A7R Mark II doesn't have that. It does, but a camera like the A9, on the other hand, does not have those things. So important things to note. But really, this all boils down to convenience. Do you want something that you can just pick up, travel light, and really not compromise incredibly? And that's why I said everyone knows for their respective work or hobby how much image detail they really need. If you absolutely have to have the highest resolution and the largest dynamic range possible, then this is what you need. If you don't need that, then I easily see the RX10 Mark IV becoming a realistic and very inexpensive, or I should say affordable, way to go with all of the features that it brings in this body. And it's not a light camera by any means, but again, start piling on those extra lenses. Think of it that way. Think of how much money you're going to spend, and then you'll realize that you may end up running into diminishing returns with a full-frame camera like the A7R Mark II, unless it's literally the difference of you making your living. So for me personally right now, if I had to pick one of these, let's say I was on my planned trip to Europe that Hurricane Matthew stalled out, then, it would be a tough decision. It would really be that difficult, and I have to say that I love the A7R Mark II. I know that I wouldn't be able to get the images out of the RX10 Mark IV that I could, or the video quality that I could with the A7R Mark II with the RX10 Mark IV. But from a convenience perspective, enjoying the trip, not focusing on, how much could be stolen from me, how much I could break, having to constantly switch lenses, and really living behind the viewfinder, so to speak, that's where the RX10 is a game changer and has been since it was introduced. It allows you, I think, really to live life and shoot rather than only shoot, if that makes any sense at all. And that's exactly what I've experienced so far with the RX10 Mark IV, is that it really can do everything. But it, again, once you start to, crop in 100% on your images, that 1-inch sensor makes itself very apparent. If you don't crop in, that's where the RX10 Mark IV, just like the Mark III before it, produces amazing results. And even more amazing because now we have an autofocus system that actually, in my use, again, because of its speed, is superior to that of the full-frame $2,400 body, which is a bargain, by the way, because this did retail for $3,200 when it launched roughly 2 years ago. So it's a tough choice between these two, and I know they're very different, like I said at the beginning, but for me personally, as I mentioned, going on a vacation, something of that nature, I'd much rather just travel with this camera, knowing that I'm not doing print publishing or anything of that nature, and none of my video needs to necessarily be broadcast or cinema quality, even though actually with this, on the video side, you can really get there, because on the video side, that 1-inch 20 megapixel sensor is the same one that I'm using right now to film this video, and it does offer amazing results. But on the still side, like I said, print, how large are these prints going to be? How much cropping capability, flexibility, and dynamic range do you need? That's where, of course, the A7R Mark II takes the cake. And then the ability to pair it with glass that just is amazing, because the FE, the full-frame E-mount lineup of glass, really has matured into a beast these days with, the G Master lineup, and now the more affordable just G-series glass that Sony has been cranking out in order to accommodate both professionals and traditional hobbyists. So very different cameras, but I absolutely can see a reason to compare these, which is why I'm comparing them for all of you today. And personally, like I said before, if I'm going on a vacation, this is the camera I'm taking, because then I'm not taking all of the lenses and I can still achieve both wide and telephoto without compromise. And then if I've got my RX10 Mark V in my pocket, then this can even stay, in the hotel room or wherever. And, I've got really maybe the ultimate, holiday traveling photography duo there, which I may end up doing a video about as well. But that pretty much sums things up. Full frame versus 1-inch sensor. That's not what this is about. This is about convenience and overall quality, and the RX10 Mark IV really being an amazing piece of kit, unlike anything out there. And that's not a knock against the A7R Mark II. It still is just an amazing camera that will only be bested by the A7R Mark III at the end of next month. So, two compelling offerings, similar feature sets, of course, not when it comes to sensor capability, size, dynamic range. You know that the autofocus on the Mark IV is superior. It won't be superior to the A7R Mark III. And of course, if you're going to be stuck with one piece of glass, this is a very good one to be stuck with. Even that aperture ring click on and off, so you can shoot by feel as opposed to in video shoot silently, and they both are silent cameras as well. Electronic shutter is there. It's really a matter of personal preference, as I've said through the whole video, but the RX10 Mark IV makes buying a camera this year all that more interesting. And options are a good thing. I mean, when you have to struggle because there are too many options, consider yourself fortunate. And that's what Sony continues to do year after year, cycle after cycle. They bring more to the table, and I swear in a single year, Sony evolves the DI market more than Canon or Nikon does in possibly 5 to 10 years. So that says a lot. And even when it comes to a point-and-shoot bridge-style camera that I didn't really ever think I'd be saying I would choose over a full-frame camera. But again, depends on what you're doing. Depends what your clients expect also, because even though, as I stated earlier, if you make your living, you probably want to stay full frame, or even APS-C or Micro Four Thirds, something larger than a 1-inch sensor, your clients may not care once they see the results. So after all, the tool you have in front of you is only as good as the operator using it to a degree, given that the product really can stand up, and both of these clearly can. So on the other hand, if you have a client that's going to scoff at the size of the cameras, then your client's a bit of an idiot. But what can you do? There are more idiots than there are intelligent people in the world. That's not news. Look at who's president. At any rate, hope you enjoyed the video. Any questions or comments, please feel free to post them. Hit that like button. And as usual, please feel free to subscribe. Later.